But there was certainly an underlying resentment in many of our communities that I think have led to some of this stuff. And Starmer didn't have his finger on the pulse at all with that. He simply thought he could dismiss it as the stuff of the far right, and that was obviously completely wrong.
This week, Axel Rudakubana has pleaded guilty to the mass stabbing that took place in Southport last year. Joining me to discuss the case is Paul Embery, the trade unionist and writer. Paul, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV. Keir Starmer has done a press conference about the case this morning. He says we're facing kind of a new threat from this kind of terrorism. Did you agree with his remarks?
I don't really have any criticisms of what he said. I think that much of it was actually quite reasonable. The government are quick out of the blocks in terms of a public inquiry, probably anticipating public reaction on that. And no doubt with an eye on some of the stuff that's been going on with the rape gangs and their refusal to hold a national public inquiry on that. There has clearly been a massive failure of state institutions over this. When you look at the number of agencies that have been involved at various parts of this young man's life, and the fact that he was referred to Prevent 3 times, the issues that he had at school in terms of violence and being expelled and so on, and other people that he came into contact with, witnesses testifying as to his particular personality and the threatening demeanour that he had and so on. So I think the public inquiry is right. What it cannot be allowed to do is hold up any debate or stifle any debate in the meantime about the incident and about some of the events surrounding it, or indeed any of the measures that need to put in place urgently to try to make sure that this sort of thing, so far as you can make sure it doesn't happen again.
One of the things in particular that seems a little unclear is that the murderer himself has been found guilty of possessing a terrorist material, for manufacturing ricin, a very dangerous poison. At the beginning of the investigation, Merseyside Police very much said that this was not going to be classified as a terrorist incident. This is something you've been looking at yourself. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I can. I mean, we know that Rudakubana's house was searched, obviously, in the hours and days early after the incident took place, and we know that the ricin was found, and the Al Qaeda terror training manual was found. We know that he was subsequently investigated under the Biological Weapons Act and for the manual, the Terrorism Act 2000, and subsequently charged under those acts. But the police, both at the beginning of the investigation, just after the incident, and then when these additional charges were laid, said on both occasions that they were not treating it as terror-related. And I found that quite strange, actually, because I thought, well, how can you investigate somebody and subsequently charge somebody under the Terrorism Act, but maintain that the incident is not terrorism related? That seems to me to be a real serious illogicality. And they stated, the police, in a statement when they laid the additional charges in October, that they were not treating it as terror related on the grounds that they had not been able to establish a motive. Again, that struck me as being strange. I'm an emergency service worker. There are incidents that have been treated as terror related that the police were not able at the time to establish a motive on. And in a piece I wrote about this a couple of days ago, I listed some of those cases: the London Bridge attack in 2019, the Manchester Victoria Station attack in 2019, the Liverpool Women's Hospital attack in 2021, which fell within the territory itself of Merseyside Police again. All 3 of those incidents, Islamist attacks. The police said they were treating as terror related, but they were keeping an open mind as to any motive. So there is a real inconsistency here between why they chose not to treat Southport as terror related on the grounds that they hadn't established a motive, but that hadn't prevented police from treating incidents as terror related in previous cases. And I think it's legitimate to ask the question, were the police on this occasion Conscious as they would have been of the stuff that was going on outside, particularly in early August when the ricin and the manual were found, all of the unrest that was taking place on the streets, could it be that they were desperate not to reveal at the time that it was being treated as terror related? So either they chose not to treat it as terror related because of those external factors, or they did but didn't tell anybody and then subsequently changed their minds. There is clearly something that doesn't stack up, and this is not wild conspiracy stuff. These are facts. We know that he was referred to Prevent, which is an explicitly counter-terrorist program, 3 times. So how can you investigate and charge someone under a terrorism act, know that they've been referred 3 times to a counter-terrorism program, and yet during your investigation and subsequently you never treat the incident, the Southport incident, as terror related? I think that's a legitimate question to ask. And I submitted a freedom of information request asking Merseyside Police if at any time they had treated the matter as terror related, and they point blank refused to answer. They cited various exemptions within the Freedom of Information Act. They didn't want to prejudice the proceedings, etc. But it strikes me that if you're happy in every other case of this kind to say whether or not something is being treated as terror related or not, then it seems to me to be no reason why you can't say on this occasion, oh, actually, we did at some point treat it as terror related, or we've never treated it as terror related. If it were the latter, that would simply be consistent with what they've said all along. So it seems to me there is possibly something, and as I say, I don't want to get into conspiracy theories. I don't believe, for example, that Keir Starmer is guilty of some sort of cover-up. I don't think there's any evidence for that. I think it's reasonable for him to say, as he said this morning, look, a Prime Minister cannot give a running commentary on this sort of stuff, and I was right not to disclose the fact that I knew that he'd been referred to Prevent 3 times. But I do think there's a legitimate question to ask of Merseyside Police in terms of whether they were influenced by external factors. I think that is a real possibility.
I mean, Nigel Farage has suggested that it's been a gigantic cover-up from day one. Do you think that goes too far based on what we know so far?
I do think it goes too far. I think there's a narrative that is developing amongst certain people that this is some big conspiracy, that, Starmer is... We've seen a load of wild stuff on the internet. We've seen stuff suggesting Starmer was involved in the case where Rudakubana's father, who came over from Rwanda, was able to stay. The court said that he could stay and that Starmer was representing him. All of it's a load of rubbish. I mean, there's no evidence for any of that at all. And we need to steer clear of that. I don't detect some major government conspiracy here. I certainly think the government in the immediate days and weeks after Southport misjudged things in terms of the public mood. And I think Starmer was wrong simply to try to attribute all of the unrest to the far right or to various sort of James Bond style villains like Tommy Robinson, Nigel Farage and people like that, or to blame it all on misinformation and disinformation. I've argued for a long time that there's a simmering resentment in a lot of our communities over issues such as immigration and integration and economic insecurity and crime and disorder and so on. And I think a lot of that was playing out in some of the unrest that took place. And I don't think that Starmer was quick enough to recognise that or to understand that there were underlying issues and that we needed to have a much wider debate on some of that stuff. It was far too lazy for him just to dismiss it as all being of the far right. So I think there's been some serious missteps by the government on this. But in terms of there being any sort of government conspiracy, no, I don't buy that. I don't think you can have a situation where a Prime Minister gives a running commentary on active criminal proceedings and gives a press conference every week saying, and now I've learned this and now I've learned that. So I don't think it was unreasonable for Starmer to make that point in the press conference this morning.
Do you think he sort of, Starmer opened himself up to charges of hypocrisy when he did kind of comment on the Southport riots and sort of suggested that the motives for them were far right, essentially? In that now he's sort of, people can sort of point to that and say, well, you're willing to sort of discuss the motives of these crimes, but not the actual murders themselves.
Yeah, I think he's opened himself up to the charge of double standards. And if look, for example, at the George Floyd protests, the Black Lives Matter protests that took place in Britain and across the world. And Starmer took the knee, and he was very supportive generally of those protests. And even though some of them were quite violent in the end, and of course he didn't support the violence, but nonetheless, he certainly made the case that there are broader issues here. There are underlying issues of racism and prejudice and discrimination, and they need to be tackled. And the killing of George Floyd has helped to highlight some of those injustices. And he bought into the Black Lives Matter campaign wholeheartedly. And here, people, I think, are right to say to him, look, some of the unrest that took place, some of the protests that took place in the summer were born of a feeling amongst people that they are alienated, that they are suffering from economic insecurity. People are struggling in some of our communities, particularly in our working class communities. They have been affected in a significant way in terms of mass immigration and the impact that that's had in terms of community cohesion and pressure on wages as a result of an oversupply of labour and so on. And some of this was spilling out. Some of the acts that people committed were monstrous. We should be clear about that. And some people deserve to go to jail. But there was certainly an underlying resentment in many of our communities that I think have led to some of this stuff. And Starmer didn't have his finger on the pulse at all with that. He simply thought he could dismiss it as the stuff of the far right. And that was obviously completely wrong.
And turning finally, Paul, to, we touched on this a little bit, but Axel Rudakubana's referral to Prevent, I think he was referred to Prevent about 3 times, actually, and each time he didn't meet the threshold for action being taken. I mean, in future, do you think we're going to have to rethink how we handle these kind of cases of these sort of lone wolf sort of fantasist types?
I think we probably do. I mean, I've worked in the fire service for nearly 30 years, 27 years or whatever it is. And emergency services constantly have to adapt their thinking and adapt their procedures, and governments have to adapt to new threats. We after 9/11, people realised that actually the threat to national security isn't one that just comes these days from other nation states. It can come from people commandeering aircraft and flying them into buildings and carrying out mass killings. And I certainly remember in the days and weeks and months after that incident, there was huge change that took place in the emergency services to try to adapt to that. So that certainly needs to take place. But at the same time, I think it needs to be coupled with a wider and an honest public debate about how we've handled some of these issues. I mean, Axel Rudakubana was not an immigrant himself, but he came from an immigrant family. I don't think it's controversial to say that. He was clearly somebody who was, from what it would appear, completely isolated from much of the rest of the community and from his school friends and so on. And I think when you also look at some of the other Islamist attacks that we've suffered down the years, we do have real problems in this country, I think, in terms of fragmentation, in terms of social disintegration. And I think the way that we've managed immigration and integration has been appalling. We've actively promoted separateness and difference through a policy of what you might call hard multiculturalism now over a number of years. And surprise, surprise, it's resulted in communities quite often and families quite often living parallel lives from each other, often in the same community, often in the same town. So I think we need a wider debate about what's happening in some of our communities and some of that disintegration that's taking place, and how that may well be attributable to some of the policies that we've implemented around multiculturalism and integration and immigration. That has to be part of it, because if we don't consider those factors, I don't think we're going to come up with the right answers.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you.